So,
Okay.
welcome, Judy. Thank you for joining us for today's interview. We're going to touch on a few different areas. Firstly, looking at your career journey to date before then going on to look at specific areas in which you specialize. So, just to give uh, the viewers of this a general overview, please can you tell me your name and provide an overview of your current role and what you're currently up to?
Sure. My name is Judy Pal. I have been a public relations practitioner for more than 40 years. Been very, very fortunate to spend time on both sides of the television camera. Spent a lot of time working in public relations in Canada, working in professional sports and consulting. And then once I moved down to the United States, have spent most of my career working in law enforcement and government PR, including stints in a couple of major cities in the United States, Baltimore, Milwaukee, and finished my career with the NYPD as an assistant commissioner there. And my job was to advise the police commissioner about everything regarding communications.
Thank you very much. And I think there you've provided a bit of an overview of your career journey to date, which is great. So we'll get stuck into the questions in earnest,
Yeah.
if that's okay. So I was hoping to start off just with maybe a short case study, and what I'd sort of frame that as is what is the or one of the most challenging professional situations you had to navigate as a police communicator, and what were some of the key lessons that you learned as a result of that experience?
From a professional standpoint, one of the most difficult things as a government communicator is really proving your worth to be sitting at the executive table. I tell people when I teach that, one of the biggest fights you're going to have is to get into the C-suite and is really to proving to the bosses that the insights and the input that you have are just as important as the insights and inputs of legal counsel. That truly has been the biggest challenge in my entire career. I've been very fortunate to work for leaders that truly understand the value of a communicator's perspective, but so many public relations communicators do not have that. Every boss thinks they're fabulous communicators. So that's probably been the biggest challenge professionally. From a case study viewpoint, there's been so many. I've worked in law enforcement, so of course there's all kinds of horrible things that happen, from employee malfeasance to natural disasters to terrorist attacks. I think the one that has affected me the most in my career was one that came very early. I was working for Halifax Regional Police in Canada, and after 9/11, we had a police officer that went down to Ground Zero in New York City and claimed he found the last survivor at Ground Zero. This was a classic case of stolen valor, and we were very limited in Canada what we could release. And it took us quite a long time to find out that he indeed did not find anyone. But the backlash, because we had to suspend this officer because we didn't know why he was down there, and there was some other issues that were part of that, became a really difficult thing. And learning from that, one is being a fairly new communicator who had just come out of television news, dealing with so many different countries and different countries with expectations that weren't the same as our laws was extraordinarily difficult. There was only two of us communicators trying to deal with the world who were paying attention to us. And then lastly, really not knowing how to deal with it until about a year later, when I was able to debrief with a bunch of experts in the United States who really were able to give us some good insights of how we could have dealt with it differently. But to this day, it's probably one of the most difficult things I ever had to deal with, because essentially it was disinformation from the standpoint of the early 2000s.
Yeah. No, and that really resonates with me, I think, because when you're quite green in the early part of your career and navigating, all the challenges that present themselves, you're navigating them for the first time. I guess that's often when you're most prone to sort of not necessarily making mistakes, but not doing things as you would do as a more experienced communicator. But I guess as well, that's really how you grow and develop quickly, right? Which is
It
by
is
sort of
absolutely.
uh, gaining experience, learning through mistakes, and sort of
Yeah.
feeling the pain of that and not wanting to repeat it again. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Your time working as a communicator, training police communicators, what have been some of the biggest changes that have taken place in the field of comms since you moved from being a day-to-day PIO to a consultant focused more on training and upskilling people in the field?
There have been two major changes in the last probably 10 years that have been happening in law enforcement and actually all government communication. One is the politicization of every single thing. So it doesn't matter if it's a crisis, it doesn't matter if it's something minor happening with their agency, everything is being politicized now. And that becomes a significant issue for anyone trying to manage a narrative. And the other, obviously, is what's happening with social media right now. It's social media allows great breadth of information, but algorithms also allow for significant blinders. So every critic having a voice and the advent, and I know we'll talk a little more about it, the advent of AI. And that's causing significant trust issues in law enforcement and in all government right now when trust in government is really at an all-time low.
You've touched on it there in your answer, but what are some of the key challenges that you've seen social media present to police communicators and leaders at this moment in time? What are you kind of hearing from the field when you're working with these people?
Some of the biggest challenges that social media places on government agencies right now is the fact that, one, speed. It used to be, we used to have something called a news cycle where you wouldn't have to be able to put information out for a couple of hours or even overnight. But now a narrative is being created almost immediately after something has happened, either a policy decision or a crisis breaking, whatever that is. Second is the um, plethora of information, whether it be correct or incorrect. There's so much information out there. What's happening is that a lot of people are looking at the amount of information and saying, I'm just tuning out. I don't know what to believe. And this goes back to a trust factor. So people are essentially tuning out. And that's what bad actors are actually looking for is for people just to say, there's so much information out there. I don't know what to believe. So I'm checking out. And that's where the fall of democracy starts.
It's a really good point and something that certainly resonates with me based on what we're seeing
Oh,
and
yeah.
hearing in the space as well. Um, But considering modern trends and things, what are some of the core guiding principles of crisis comms that first responder PIOs need to follow during a live response?
There are a number of core principles that first responders should be considering when they're dealing with a crisis. First of all, is do you have the ability to monitor what is happening in the social sphere? Because what is happening now is that most crises don't break with a call to emergency services or a call from a reporter. That's all breaking on social media. So if you don't have an ability to monitor what's happening on social media, then you're already at a huge disadvantage because the narrative has already gotten ahead of you, and whoever frames the narrative first actually wins in the court of public opinion. That's huge. The other thing is that if we don't have the ability to put out correct information and correct dis, mis, and malinformation, we are at a huge disadvantage. Reason being, young people today are not going to Google, they're not going to their favorite media outlet to see what's happening. They're actually using AI. This is where people are using Perplexity and Grok and ChatGPT to get their information. So if we're not putting information online where AI can grab that information, we are doing our constituents a disservice because that's where they're getting their information. So, one of the biggest things that communicators should be focusing on today is countering that mis, dis, and malinformation online. So, rumor control pages, FAQ pages are extraordinarily important. And the third thing is speed. We have to have the ability to be able to respond quickly. And in government, that's one of the most difficult things to do because everybody and their sisters and brothers want to approve messaging before it goes out. This is where communications planning, crisis guides, holding statements become extraordinarily important so we can address issues as they come up almost immediately.
Just how big, and you've already touched on this, but just how big a challenge is misinformation for police and more widely government communicators?
Misinformation and disinformation is probably one of the biggest threats that we have in public communications today, especially from a government perspective. AI generated mis and disinformation. Europol put out a white paper a couple of years ago that said by the end of 2026, 90% of social media would be synthetically generated. That's ridiculous. There's a executive with TikTok who says already he's seeing about 75% of what's on TikTok is synthetically generated, which is essentially AI generated. The problem is, the challenge that we have is that people have generally believed their eyes. Think about the words we use. I won't believe that till I see it. I saw that with my own two eyes. But now that we even have to question everything that we see, it becomes this whole thing about trust. Who do we trust? And Edelman's Trust Barometer, which just came out recently, was talking about the fact that people's trust groups are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So government and public safety have a huge responsibility of building these trust groups, of getting into that small trust group. So crisis communications is very local. And that becomes extraordinarily difficult when you have national things happening. For COVID, for example, there was messages coming nationally, but who are people going to believe? They're going to believe their local areas. So that's just a couple of the challenges that we're facing now with mis, dis, and malinformation.
Thank you. And I think you've probably covered this off, but we'll ask it specifically just so we have it contained to one question. What are some of the top tips you would provide or you are providing to police communicators in terms of how to effectively manage the various different types of misinformation that we see surfacing?
Our biggest challenge in trying to manage this mis, dis, and malinformation animal is really one, knowing it's out there. So monitoring becomes extraordinarily important. It is not inexpensive to monitor social media. So that also becomes a resource thing. Where do we find the funding for something like that? We also have to get much better at education. So, educating our communities about what they're seeing, but there has to be a trust factor there first. We have to educate elected officials so they can actually have legislation that keeps up with this. There's a country that just passed legislation about copywriting our images and our voices. I mean, this is something that we would never have ever thought about it before. But I know that in my training, I generate words and I put words in mouths of police chiefs across the country. And I do it in a humorous way, but it is not very difficult because everyone's face is online and everyone's voice is online. Any news conference, any police chief is going to have their voice online to create messaging that is not only incorrect, but also horrible for people in their communities. So when it comes to preparing, we need to do a much better job at educating. But the bottom line is this: legitimacy is creating that trust in your community before the bad information goes out. So people will actually trust you when you come out and say that was bad information or that was AI generated.
Are there some preparedness measures that communicators should be taking to ensure that they're equipped to deal with the threat of misinformation? So, what sort of good practices are you seeing communicators, forces take to tackle the threat?
It's really important to be strategic when you are addressing bad information, especially online bad information. One of the first questions you have to ask is who is it reaching? You know, if this is reaching a couple of people and it's not gaining any virility, don't amplify the message. That's always the biggest concern. If I point out bad information, am I actually amplifying bad information? And if it's amplified bad information, are more people going to access it? And is AI going to put that ahead of the other things? Here's the thing about AI that we have to understand, and all bad information that we have to understand. AI will draw information not only from what is repeated the most, but what sources that AI believes are credible. And if you haven't developed the legitimacy or the credibility before something happens, the information that is going to be sourced by AI is probably going to come from some of your biggest critics. So this becomes a huge strategic challenge of what you're putting out there. And it also brings up a thought of reconsidering what you're using for social media because so many social media platforms now have a reputation for slanting one way or the other. But this comes to a point now where 5 years ago, I was not a big fan of having agency specific apps. Now I've become quite a fan of agency specific apps because that gives people in a community, if they trust your agency, one place to go to get valid, credible, and legitimate information. So it's something to think about, but it's just strategy becomes really important here.
So more of a focus on owned channels, which is kind of a sort of, I guess, a step back relative to where we had gotten, which was sort of making sure you're contributing to the conversation where people are looking on social. We're almost sort of regressing to a point where there are these sort of safe spaces, I guess, where people can find information at
Yeah.
source.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's something, Chris, that we need to talk more about is that, we always thought that earned media was always better than paid media, and I'm still a proponent of that. But the problem is that no one knows who to trust. And if I'm someone that is looking at one social media platform all the time, and my algorithms have now focused that, so I'm only seeing one particular feed, if I love dogs and my particular dog, I'm clicking on the black labs, that's all I'm going to be getting. I'm not going to hear anything about the Cocker Spaniels. So this is something that we have to be really concerned about because as much as we thought that the World Wide Web was going to open everybody's eyes, what it's really done is created absolute tunnels for people to see through now.
Okay. Thank you, Judy. That's all I had.